Hi guys, it's Maria again, and for my third presentation, I thought it might be interesting to look at the ethics of Coeur's business model and judge the extent to which he was guilty of what his contemporaries might judge as moral digressions. In order to do this, I want to spend some time first talking about the guild system that developed in the 12th century with the proliferation of cities, a system which I think was at least to some extent similar to Coeur's network of associates, though on a much more local scale. Afterwards, I think it might be worthwhile to discuss the premier business ethicist of the 1440s when Coeur was operating at his most successful, Nider. Although Nider was a contemporary of Coeur's, he was working primarily in what is today Germany, so I thought it would be prudent also to discuss Iberian business ethics, specifically Spanish ones according to the Salamanca school, which operated around 70 years after Coeur's death. I hope to convince you that it was not only professional jealousy and outliving his usefulness that led to Coeur's trial, as Ryerson, the author of the book we read this week, Jacques Coeur, Entrepreneur and King's Bursar, argues, but also the fact that Coeur was genuinely not behaving very ethically in business, at least according to 15th century European standards. Prior to the 12th century, craftsmen did not typically organize themselves into guilds. The craftsmen were agents of the manor, still very dependent on the landlords to earn a living and to get by. However, with the development of cities, the manorial system was disrupted, and the craftsmen, newly independent of the manor, were now more dependent on the markets than ever. They organized themselves into guilds for security. The rise of the guilds really bridges the gap between a sustenance economy and a profit economy in medieval Europe. We can see the development of a market economy as very closely tied to the modern principles of individual freedoms and the emergence of a quote-unquote legally constituted state in the 16th century, end quote. In the absence of state law and the concept of individual freedoms, there was guild law and the concept of a collective freedom. Already we notice that Coeur frustrated this idea of collectivism in the pursuit of individual profits. According to business historian Christelle Muguiot, this insistence on collectivism is arguably why the guilds did not survive. The presence of guilds is evidence that there was some form of business organization even as early as the 12th century. For this reason, it is hard to believe that business ethics is a wholly modern discipline. Historian Daniel Wren argues against the assertion that business ethics has no history, tracing it as far back as the Middle Ages. He considers one of the founders of the discipline of economics as Aristotle, who was interested in a virtuous way to conduct exchange. Medieval thinkers known as the Scholastics, a school of thought to which Nider belonged, tried to reconcile Greco-Roman, particularly Aristotelian thought, and the teachings of the Church. Nider set out to do this with special attention to morality for business people. He came to the conclusion that the market should be the judge of the price of a product, empowering the consumer, or more specifically the local community of consumers. Coeur, however, was operating on a much larger scale than just a local community. Nider argued that any business practice on the part of the seller that robbed the consumer of his power, like, quote-unquote, concealing defects, selling to a simpleton or one lacking expertise, or forcing the buyer by circumstance, end quote. Coeur effectively committed two of these moral crimes. The first when he gave devalued ingots to the Levant on behalf of the King of France so that the ingots were essentially defective, and the third when he effectively created a salt monopoly in Languedoc, forcing the buyers to purchase his product. Nider also wrote that a seller can only ask for a higher price from the buyers than what he spent to acquire his product, according to how much work he went to make the product more useful. Finally, Nider had a problem with lending money at interest. Meanwhile, Coeur famously had indebted both the French royalty and the aristocracy. Business morality was important because it was another facet of morality necessary to achieve salvation. When Coeur's associates tried to make him appear like a churchman during his trial, perhaps it was an attempt to sidestep the necessity of business morality. If Coeur was a legitimate churchman, then the implication would be that his business endeavors must have been in accordance to Christian moral values. The Salamanca School, which had its golden age beginning in 1526 at the University of Salamanca, was like the scholastics very interested in business ethics as it tried to bridge the gap between reason and Christianity. It was very concerned with usury, which it defined not only as making loans, but also coin exchanges. Thus again, Coeur's behavior with the Levant was considered morally condemnable. Unlike Nider, the theorists of the Salamanca school concentrated on the relationship between merchant and political authorities. According to this school, the favoritism Charles VII had shown Coeur early in his career was morally reprehensible. They argued against subsidies and unfair taxation. Perhaps indicative of the 70-year gap between the advent of this school of thought and the date of Coeur's death, members of the Salamanca school were also invested in individual human rights and their protection, an interest that Muguiot might consider both integral to the creation of a profit economy and also a symptom of it. We can never know definitively whether Coeur was actually guilty of treason or any of the other crimes that he was accused of. Certainly a degree of professional jealousy and the desire to further personal interests with his demise factored into the accuser's motivations. However, it is also a possibility that Coeur did not always behave according to 15th-century standards of business ethics. Thank you for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions about my sources, I will attach a bibliography to the blackboard.